The Trump administration announced new efforts through the FDA to try to combat the spread of coronavirus and treat those who are already infected. In addition to vaccine trials that started earlier this week, the FDA has also fast-tracked clinical trials of antiviral treatments.
Many Americans have read studies and heard media reports about this drug chloroquine, which is an anti-malarial drug. It's already approved, as the president said, for the treatment of malaria as well as an arthritis condition. That's a drug that the president has directed us to take a closer look at as to whether an expanded use approach to that could be done to actually see if that benefits patients. And again, we want to do that in the setting of a clinical trial, a large pragmatic clinical trial, to actually gather that information and answer the question that needs to be answered.
Newsy health reporter Lindsay Thies joins us now from her home in Denver as we all try to practice social distancing. Lindsay, that's just one of two drugs that the FDA will be investigating to see if it can treat coronavirus.
That's right, Lauren. And these two drugs that were mentioned in today's briefing, chloroquine, which we just heard FDA Commissioner Stephen Hahn talk about there, as well as this drug Remdesivir, have been two drugs that Newsy has really been reporting on and following since they were first being announced being used in clinical trials back in the first week of February 7th. These two drugs, a little bit of background, Remdesivir is something that would be administered by doctors via IV in a hospital setting. And then chloroquine, it has been around for decades and is most usually taken right now for malaria or arthritis in a pill form. Between hydroxychloroquine, chloroquine, and remdesivir, there are about 20 clinical trials going on right now globally to see how they can be used to treat coronavirus patients.
Remdesivir and chloroquine are two drugs at the head of the race for a coronavirus treatment. What are they and what do they do? Remdesivir is an antiviral drug from U.S. drug maker Gilead Sciences. Remdesivir is experimental. It was developed during 2013's Ebola epidemic. It works like some current HIV treatments by blocking the proteins that coronaviruses need to replicate.
In many cases, when we have a new disease, researchers will look to see what the activity of existing drugs is against a new infectious disease. In certain circumstances where there is reasonable empirical evidence, countries may use those drugs. This is a licensed product which is licensed for use in a certain disease, but because the drug is considered to be safe and effective in another disease, in a controlled environment, those drugs can be tested against something like coronavirus. But it's extremely important when that is done that clinical data is collected on the experience of the patient.
Remdesivir isn't licensed or medically approved anywhere in the world. Instead, health regulators allow something called compassionate use or expanded access. They greenlight unproven treatments for patients with potentially life-threatening conditions when there are no other treatments to try. In Washington state, doctors gave remdesivir to the U.S.'s first coronavirus patient, a 35-year-old man, along with drugs to manage his cough and fever. His condition improved. Chinese researchers also found combining remdesivir with chloroquine, an 80-year-old malaria drug, was, quote, highly effective in lab tests. Since then, they've accelerated remdesivir into human clinical trials for some of China's coronavirus patients. China has filed for a patent for the treatment, according to the Virology Institute in Wuhan. If China gets the patent, other drug makers and countries would need to get permission to sell it. But Wuhan scientists say for the time being, they won't invoke their patent rights as long as foreign pharmaceutical companies cooperate on finding a treatment that works.
So, Lindsay, the president and the FDA commissioner said today they're beginning to roll out large clinical trials in the U.S. How do these trials work, and what do we know at this point about the time frame?
Absolutely. Well, to understand the clinical trial process, it is something that is rightfully so pretty arduous, Lauren. So we're talking about patient safety here. So the way that any new drug like remdesivir, for example, is put out through these clinical trial processes is it has to go through 3 different phases of clinical trials before the FDA will sign off on it and say, yes, it is safe, it is effective for widespread patient use. Some examples, this vaccine that has started in clinical trials that we talked about being announced earlier this week. That is in a phase 1 clinical trial. So you're talking much smaller patient populations. The vaccine, for example, is currently being tested on about 45 patients. Remdesivir, for example, is already in phase 3 clinical trials, primarily where they're looking at patient populations around about 1,000. And those patients are primarily, according to Gilead Sciences, at hospitals in Asian countries, and those phase 3 clinical trials began in early March.
And then let's talk about this malaria drug that they're going to be testing, because there's already a potential issue. There's a shortage of it.
That's right. So for other stories that we've been reporting on related to drug shortages and how they're being impacted by this ongoing coronavirus pandemic, we've been following the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. They have a database and they track globally all different kinds of drug shortages and have been doing so for about 2 decades. Aaron Fox, who is a researcher out of the University of Utah Hospital, as well as the individual who really researches and manages this database, I spoke with her today, and she told me both chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine are already experiencing drug shortages. There's only one supplier globally for chloroquine, and with any type of increased demand, which has already been started to be seen, that supplier is facing the strain. And then she said hydroxychloroquine has 8 different drug suppliers globally, but has also begun to report, these drug suppliers have begun to report shortages because of different increased demand from hospitals and doctors wanting to stock up on the medication.
Newsy Health reporter Lindsay Thies, thank you for making sense of this for all of us and for your reporting. You have been on this talking about these drugs since early February, so really ahead of the curve. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.